Hi, 3DMJers. This is Andrea Valdez, and you are listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Eric Helms and Brad Loomis as we discuss the role of science in natural bodybuilding. So now that we've had a couple of episodes under our belt debunking the conventional wisdom that science is everything, we thought it was time to discuss how much it actually does matter for us. Like, how does 3DMJ stay up to date on the latest practical research for our athletes? How do we ignore the fluff and stick with what's actually useful for our coaching needs? And how much science do you even need to know to produce successful athletes? In this episode, we'll go over all of our own personal learning methods for this stuff and discuss some ways that new coaches can learn to spot sound, credible sources from the millions of training, nutrition, supplement, and fitness marketing articles written online like every day. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this as much as we did. Here is Eric Helms, Brad Loomis, and myself discussing how much science really does matter in the sport of natural bodybuilding. Helms, can you start with your, where it falls in line priority-wise with your, you had an Instagram post, you had an article. Give me
I did. I had an Instagram post, and I might get the order wrong, but so emotional intelligence, a true care about your clients. What else did I can't remember all the shit I said anymore.
Oh my God, we could look it up.
Experience.
Okay.
We could. Experience, emotional intelligence, a true care about your clients, and a good communication. Those were the four that I thought were all more important than having a solid understanding of science.
Okay. Now, in this episode, can we talk about how solid we think solid is? I guess is a good way to put that. Like, as you know, I tend to, I have a master's in exercise physiology, but I undervalue that probably more than most people. Whereas I know there are a lot of people that have PhDs in our industry that are very highly valued, but either haven't coached before, haven't dieted before, don't study the people as much, stuff like that. And I guess in my case, what I find to be most valuable is my coaching background, and that took a long time. And then Brad, I know he says he's a natural coach. But the thing is, Brad is, other than you, Eric, probably, in my opinion, the most science-based of us coaches. Do you feel like that helps you? Go ahead.
I don't know. Why am I trying to talk about Brad? Brad's here. Go ahead, ask him.
Brad, why do you think that is? And do you think it comes to a giant advantage? When do you throw away the numbers?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, because I'm a kind of a wannabe science guy. You know, I'm the guy that reads science, thinks he understands it, then tries to apply it, and then usually ends up getting it twisted around. You know what I mean? And so for me, a lot of times, I almost kind of have to take the numbers and throw them out, right off the bat, because I interpret them wrong. It's like I need a pastor, I need a preacher to interpret the Bible for me and give it to me the way that it's supposed to be done. You know what I mean? And that's kind of where I sit a lot of times with the numbers. I need a guy like Eric to take the numbers and say, look, okay, this is what it's really saying. This is how it truly applies. This is how we truly need to use this and keep it in application with our clients.
Yeah, and
I like that you brought that up, because there's a big difference between being data-driven and systematic and collecting data, which is great. I think Brad's very good at that. And then knowing what the data means and how it can be applied or how it fits in context with things. So it's a very good distinction that Brad made there.
Yeah, and I think, too, that when we say the numbers, I guess when I was asking it is like it's such a huge advantage when Brad can pick apart the body weight trends, the volume increases over time, how that relationship is, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, and so all that's cool, but I feel like that's a different type of data set that you're so skilled at versus like Eric being able to read the stats in a study and look at the correlation versus causation, the context within it, because there's all these things like the sample size and is it the right population, and blah. So the application is what we're so lucky to have Eric with, or have Eric help us with. But I think that's the biggest misconception on my part is like I read it so I know it. And that's very,
Yeah.
like Eric, you work with grad students, right? And how many times do they read something, feel like they know it and can deliver it, and then you're like, well, but did you consider? I mean, doesn't that happen all the time?
Well, man, forget grad students. How many times
Yeah.
are there high-level professors who, while I respect their knowledge, I know that because they are uber focused in one little area, which is the nature of being a PhD or professor, is that you have a very focused area because it's just too much to know. You get a memorizable education as a bachelor student, and then as a master's student, you get to become a novice researcher and get kind of the high-level nuances. And then to become a true master, you don't master exercise physiology, you master a distinct portion of it, and that's your PhD, and then your research afterwards. So, like when I see certain research in protein metabolism or periodization, which are my main areas, and someone is clearly missing a piece of other research I'm not aware of, and they're really interpreting it in a strange way, they make some funky conclusions that I completely disagree with, and I'm sure I've done it as well. I try not to overstep my lane, but man, there are some papers out there that are published by highly regarded people that I completely and fundamentally disagree with, and that happens more likely than you'd think. So it is not just about memorizing information; it's also about understanding what it means, and I think that's basically the role I play. And I would say I'm not even as good at Brad at the data-driven, pragmatic stuff. Like, for example, I might present to the team, like, hey, here's a variable that really matters. We need to be looking at, volume load over time. And then Brad will come up with some badass spreadsheet of how to actually track volume load. Or I'll find he's tracking in a different way, a more creative way. So I might point the team in the direction of here's some things that we should be caring about with our athletes. And then what they do with that is always creative, different, and sometimes better than what I would even come up with.
Yeah. And what do you...
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brad.
Well, I was just going to say, to answer your original question, about when do you throw out the numbers, kind of like you said, again, the numbers have to be taken all into context, because numbers, while they are a great way of being able to track things, there's always unquantifiable ways of increasing volume and doing things like that you don't see with numbers. And so, I don't know if I always throw out the numbers, but there's always times when you have to say, you know what, something doesn't quite make sense here. We need to get a bigger picture, and we need to figure out what's happening on the unquantifiable side. And by that, I mean, like Eric's recent, little video that he did on range of motion. An increase in the range of motion while numbers are going down is actually an unquantifiable increase in volume. And so that's when you got to kind of take the numbers and take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. I hope that answers the original question.
Yeah. Well, like personally, the way I like to think of it is like not shitting on people that pay close attention to the numbers and the philosophy and the things that we do know science-wise. It's just, I feel like if I first get a client or when you first get someone, the whole point of having that sound base level understanding of the science is so that when you get someone, you have the calculations, the principles, like the real basic shit. But after the first 2-3 check-ins, now it's just feedback loops of how this person's responding to what you thought the original equations were, right? So I feel like, in my opinion, I use science less and less the longer I have an athlete. But like to start them on something, I need to know how to, quote unquote, like set up the original plan. Yep. And then everything from there on out, I feel like it's like this gradual, less science, more results driven of what's actually happening with the human. Would y'all agree with that?
I wouldn't even agree with it. I would say that is the way it's supposed to be. And I don't think people realize that.
Yeah.
I think science fundamentally can't tell you what to do on a day-to-day basis with an athlete. I mean, the actual way that science is done, it is answering questions about tens, hundreds, or in other fields, thousands of people at a time, and giving you the average response and then the variation in that response, right? So at best, what that can do is you can say, okay, this is a study on powerlifters of the reasonable similarity to the person I'm working with. Okay, I can paint the broad structure of their program. But then exactly like you said, the more time you spend with that person, the more you're ignoring the data on thousands of powerlifters, and you're paying attention to the data from last week, which is
Yeah.
just the data point you're dealing with. So I think people just kind of get it twisted sometimes. They don't know what the role of science is. It's to get us in the right ballpark. It's to give us an idea of what are the fundamental principles, but how you apply the principles is infinitely more important once you understand the principles than going back to those mean values and those, kind of the studies themselves.
Yeah.
And it's still they're still tools. Like you said, they're tools that get us going in the right direction. But it's just like your tool bag. You may on one particular job use your hammer less and less and less and less, as you're going through a job. And so when you need to make a coaching call, it's like, well, what's the best coaching call for this? First you're going to look at what the client's been doing and what works for them. And then when you've got two ways that you could go, maybe then you kind of use science as a tool to say, well, we could go either way on this. Maybe this way here might be just a smidgen better. It's still a tool. And it's not going to be the one way be all of the way you do business.
Yeah. And like sometimes too, it's like I have 5 options and I'm like, well, all 5 of these could work on how to handle this roadblock with a certain client. And I'm like, legit, I'll just fucking pick one. And if it works, great. And if not, I have 4 others that I have to, just by process of elimination, try to get us out of whatever hole or hold up we're having, And that's not just tools like, okay, fat's not being lost this week. Some people you need to feed them more. Some people you need to feed them less. Some people you need to tell them to take a rest day. Some people need to sleep more. There's just so many things that can go that, science has told us all these things can break plateaus in fat loss. But then it's like you take that data point and like, where can this person improve? Because maybe they have a 2-month-old baby and like sleep's not the option. Well, then maybe the rest day is. And that's just kind of how I think about it. Like in the presentation I get this Shredded by Science thing, it's like there's 1,000 things you could do, but just I think as a coach, having a personal system, and that's mine, being like, pretend that they were a robot and all you had was science and they had no feelings or life issues. And that might give you these 5 options. And then you take into consideration this person that knocks it down to 3 or 4 options. And then you consider their lifestyle, emotional state. And now you've come to like the one place where it's like, this is most likely of those 5 going to be the most applicable to this human. That's how I think of it. But I think everyone should have their own like way of dealing it. But that's, I guess, my personal process, if that's useful.
Yeah. I think that you and I do the exact same thing. It's just that how we derive upon our final call is probably just a little bit different.
And I don't necessarily like think of that,
very,
it just
very minutely different.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm the same way. It's like, okay, here's the 5 things that we could do. Let's present this to the person, say what works best for you.
Yeah.
They come back with, it's kind of like a bartering system all back. They come back with, I know I could do these 2 things of those 5. Well, then maybe at that point I'll say, well, if it's 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other, let me use either what science that I know, or maybe go, plug Eric's brain and say, which one do you think would be best?
And that's really the role of, one of the roles that I think science should give you is to have options,
Yeah.
Because if you think about the way that, let's say a coach completely unaware of science, they have some mentor or they have their own personal experience. They have experience to guide them, which is very valuable. They know what worked for them and potentially, if they're savvy, what's worked for a broad range of people. And that can be very useful. But the usefulness of reading a bunch of literature and understanding the actual mechanisms is you become aware of other potential ways to get to that same place. Right. And that just gives you more options. And then you can start to do exactly what you guys said to do is weigh those options and decide what makes the most sense in a given context. But if you only have experience or if you only have science, either way, you're just going to have less potential ways to go.
Yeah. I think that's important.
But I also...
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was saying I think that's important what you said, that other people like experience. Like, for example, we take me. I've only competed on a stage 4 times, but I not only have y'all's experiences, I spent, 4 or 5 years in the community looking at other people's experiences, hearing their stories. We have our private Facebook group. I am also, when I get into something, as you'll know, I obsess. So I've read tons of shit, like watched tons of people. Like, it was like any competitor I could get on for like 5-10 years. So I know the roundabout, pretty vague because I'm not like in their body, but hundreds and hundreds of people, stage time experience. And I think it is important to feel at least one prep, yeah, but for those like younger people who are listening, like, shit, I don't have all that experience. I feel like as long as you are attentive to what's going on in the world of your specific niche, whether that is Gen Pop or whatever, it doesn't have to be just you with the experience.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can immerse yourself in the conversation of coaches and of people who are trying to deal with these things and competitors who are all troubleshooting either their own or their athletes' roadblocks, which is really what coaching is, and the way science hopefully would come into play. I also don't like to even get people in the mindset of, is experience or science better, like they are almost two sides of the same coin or two different things. In many ways, I look at them I like to present them as very different things, because if the option is either science or experience, then people think, well, if I'm not going to compete, then if I get a PhD, I'll be good to go. And it's like, no, the role of science is about best practice, right? Which will always continue evolving as we know more. Mm-hmm. But coaching is a relationship and interacting with people, and like you said, bargaining sometimes and figuring out things to do and working with someone to get them in a direction. And sure, our options will change and our decisions of which options are better. That's the realm of science. But choosing the option and actually talking with the person, those are two different skill sets. So you can, I think that's something that I always try to present to people, is knowing all of the science doesn't make you a good coach. It's not even on the same page. It's like, it's a different skill. Of course, every coach needs to be aware of what makes scientific sense at the moment, but that's really more just about staying on top of your continuing education rather than doing the job itself.
Right. And I think what's important too is we talked about like that base level of science to know how to set up someone based on best practices, but there is a point where you know enough to do your job, and continuing to read shit it's not going to come up with this, like you said, there's 5 options. It might be a decade before a 6th, like, scientifically sound, proven option comes up, right? Whereas on yourself, on your insides as a coach, you can be practicing that all the time. You can be gaining experience all the time. You can be looking at other people's anecdotal shit all the time. Whereas science, I feel like if you keep reading and reading into rabbit holes, especially people who aren't very experienced researchers, every new study, you're going to get something that conflicted with the previous study. Like, there's so many little opinions and variations when it's like, there's literally one big picture, like, say, creatine. Like, how many bazillions of conflicting studies are there on creatine? Whereas if you go to, like, examine.com or some very well-established, highly regarded, like, big old meta-analysis review, you could get the same shit. You don't need to read all the studies within that review because you'll just confuse yourself. But you can keep researching other competitors, listening to people that that do this for a living, stuff like that. And I think, I had to literally stop myself at some point when I was doing my own prep from reading scientific anything, because I was just confusing myself and second guessing myself. So it's like, I know enough. Stop it. That's what I think.
And I run into that all the time.
Yeah.
Where I get questions from people who I've been answering their questions for sometimes years, and I kind of sit down and I got to go, look, man, like, if you're asking these, you're still in the hunt because you think there's either a silver bullet or you think you're going to find a great breakthrough, and you don't have any confidence in your kind of like baseline understanding. Like, I don't think it's valuable for you to read another article on X, because you're going to find someone or something that conflicts with it. And often when that happens, it's the person who doesn't have a solid foundational kind of understanding of the concepts. And I think too often people, like you guys said, will treat science like it's knowledge that I tick off. If I read this study and I understand the conclusions and how they got there, then I know something. But really, to have a true understanding, is you need to understand how that piece fits into the whole. And a lot of people without the whole memorize science, and they make these sometimes obviously egregious errors when it comes to common sense, or someone who does have kind of that overarching understanding of it. And yeah, so that I think is a very common flaw that people make, is they don't know how to put things into context. And there's a lot of tools out there to help people understand that, like hierarchy of evidence. Like, like you said, a meta-analysis is probably the best place to go for an overarching theme on a topic. If that's not there yet, you would try to get maybe a systematic review that kind of qualitatively rather than, statistically can tell you, yeah, the majority of the studies kind of lean this way, And then on there, if it goes to randomized controlled trials down to less controlled types of studies. And just understanding that is something that a lot of people don't have. And it's so easy to let confirmation bias put something higher than it should be. So, like if there's 10 studies on something and you fully believe that, it's option A is the best one because of your personal experience, you're going to kind of devalue all the option B outcomes. And even if there's only 2 out of those 10 studies that confirm your thing, for some reason in your brain, and you'll make it work logically, those 2 studies are the ones that matter, and the rest are methodologically flawed, or they had, funding or something like that. So there's all these things in play within the critical thinking that is science and the scientific method to prevent you from tricking yourself into, and basically, into buying into your own biases. That's why we have, things like in place like peer review and meta-analyses and things like that, so that we don't go down the wrong rabbit hole and end up making, inappropriate assumptions.
Yeah, and what I think is cool about, like, I know, like, you're a science guy, you're an R&D guy, you're the one getting his PhD, all that stuff. But like I said earlier, I know that Brad is very, out of all of us, he's very inquisitive, and I admire that about you, Brad, and that you're always looking to get better and better and better. Do you ever shut yourself off? Like I said, I shut myself off. Or with you, do you find like it's better to converse with someone like Eric, or that you highly regard, as far as getting their opinion? Like, how do you contain it from you absorbing some information, and how do you vet it on your own? Do you just bounce it off people? Do you just keep going? Like, how do you like to absorb it, I guess is what I'm asking. And how do you pick the good from the bad?
And, I think probably the biggest, I guess the first thing that I always consider whenever I'm looking at something, or I'm trying to kind of use what we call science, is self-awareness. I know myself, and I know that I'll sometimes just misunderstand things. I'll know that I'll misinterpret the data a little bit, and sometimes emotionally I get excited. It's like, ooh, look at this. And so I know that about myself, and that's kind of the very first thing that I think about is self-awareness. Okay. So then it's kind of like, okay, now I go through the tiers. A lot of times I better read that study again. I better look through it again. I better start looking at the charts and the graphs and really making sure, is this truly what this is saying, And then usually kind of my last level before I just start applying it to somebody is bouncing it off of Eric, or just throwing it up in our R&D, amongst all the coaches, Hey, thinking about doing this with me, with X client, with et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is where I got my idea from. What do you guys think? And then beyond that, there's times, and it's a lot of times where Eric's going to say, dude, that's not a good idea. And it's really my responsibility as a coach to just open up my ears and say, oh, why is that? And not shut down and say, Eric, you're wrong. I know that I'm right with this. I got to keep that open mind, and not get defensive and not say, oh, well, sure, thanks, Eric, and then go do it anyway. Yeah. So that's kind of my, hierarchy of using the tool. It's self-awareness, knowing how I am more than anything. and then going down on through the levels. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think what's cool what you said is like that you read it and get real excited and you're like, oh shit, is this something like new and crazy? And I think a lot of people do that. And then you have to wonder, like if I'm reading, like if I just started reading scientific articles, right? Which again, we'll go there next. I won't start that yet. But if I'm like not a PhD student, master's student, I'm not very, very well educated or versed in scientific literature. I see something and it's like, oh my God, I've never heard this before. This is so new and da da da. Like my first reaction would be like, probably, is there a reason I haven't heard this everywhere yet? And what's crazy to me is that people are like, shiny light bulb must be right because it was in a scientific paper. I'm going to go blast all over social media and use it with all my clients instead of like, well, why haven't I heard this everywhere yet? If it was some great newfound thing, but no one else is talking about it, then maybe it just hasn't been proved time and time and time and time and time and time again. So therefore, I might be missing the concept.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of psychology that goes into this. So there's a reason why the supplement industry is successful, even though 9.5 items out of 10 are crap. And it's because people want there to be that silver bullet. They want there to be that solution. And that's how the supplement industry markets itself.
Yeah. And
the supplement industry is so closely intertwined with the fitness industry. And the fitness industry, even outside of the supplement industry, has that similar feel, like, biceps in 10 days, 14-day abs, or 30-minute, whatever, all this stuff that's about get it yesterday kind of thing. So that is culturally ingrained in the way we see ourselves and look at information in our community, and especially the bodybuilding community. So even when someone is trying to make that shift to going towards, okay, I've acknowledged that, science and empirically gained ideas through the scientific method are probably going to be the most reliable information, they're still going to be prone to that shiny light bulb, like you said, so something's going to come out, and if it's on the edge of science, right, if it's something that is cutting edge or controversial, and that some people it's very natural that people will be very hyperbolic about it. They'll be very excited about it because A, it fits the criteria of being in the science thing, which their brain has decided is good, but B, it hasn't been well studied enough for people to say and well define what it can and can't do. So when it's something that's on the edge of discovery, it always gets put like on a pedestal until it's been researched more. Like, and I can think of tons of things like that right now, like fascia. People are freaking out over fascia, or the ketogenic diet. People are freaking out over this stuff, and then, if that's something that can also be monetized, then you start to get, biased information out there, which can masquerade as science. So you have all these competing things. And, it's funny you asked Brad that question of how does he vet things for himself. I remember how I used to vet things for myself back in like 2007, 2008, before I'd even started my bachelor's. And I think for me, the most important thing was to understand the concept of skeptical thinking and the scientific method. If I can actually understand the way that scientists think and not actually understand the science, that is a huge step in the right direction. So if I understand that, okay, we need to control variables, compare things, and then be able to reliably and reproducibly say, okay, this in this context is always better. If I can understand that mindset, that takes you very far, because then I can start to identify people who are actually good critical thinkers. I may not have the knowledge base to have been evaluating things like Lane Norton or Joe Klimczewski or Lyle McDonald or Alan Aragon back in 2000 or 2008, but I could tell that they were doing it right. And there was a difference between the guy who was posting about science and saying things in black and white terms and how this is amazing, this is going to be a game changer, oh, and by the way, buy my book, Supplement Coaching, or whatever, versus the guy who was saying, here's a in-depth look at this and when and why it's important, and using words like maybe and possibly rather than definitely and always. And so I started latching on to people who showed me what critical thinking was. Even though I didn't know their depth of knowledge, I knew, okay, I can trust this person, at least that they're being intellectually honest in their evaluation. And I got a small list of people like that. So I was following, your James Krieger, your Brad Schoenfeld, your Alan Aragon, your Bret Contreras, your Lyle McDonald, your Lane Norton. I had a list of people, and I would read all their stuff and see where their opinions were on things. And I didn't put them on a pedestal, though. I just realized they had that skill I was trying to develop, plus a great breadth of knowledge, and those things combined are kind of where I'm at now. So I think that's the key thing. Don't think that reading a billion studies is going to make you really, really knowledgeable. It'll give you a lot of knowledge, but understanding that stuff really comes down to developing the skill of critical thinking.
Yeah, and that's what I like that Brad said, and I was going to say, like, that's how I learned. It was like Brad goes through his tiers, but the ultimate tier is like, and then I check it with my source of information who I know has a good grasp on this stuff. And I do that same shit too, but I did a lot of this on my own preliminarily. I'm making words up. That's not even, is that even a word?
That's a word.
Oh,
preliminarily?
Yeah, okay. You know that word. When I was back in the day trying to figure this shit out, I was in grad school, but I would still say that I'm not even that good at reading scientific papers, to be honest. What I think I learned, everything I learned about bodybuilding was through Lane Norton, through 3DMJ videos, Lane Norton's old bodybuilding.com videos. And like you said, I understand it now, but back then, I guess I would ever had the innate ability to, I guess, read the good science from the bad, or follow the good people from the bad, or just in the way they presented it. I still don't necessarily know how I know these things, but I feel like I'm a really good like people picker as far as who I follow and who I don't. And that is one of the biggest things is promises, guarantees, always is, nevers is like such. If someone speaks in absolute knowledge, I almost always know that that's a red flag. Or if they give numbers that there's no way you can know that, like this works in 12 weeks. This will lose 10% body fat. This will da-da-da. And I'm like, how the fuck do you know that? You know? And that didn't take schooling for me. It was just, like you said, just there's a critical thinking ability that comes with being, what should come with being a coach. Not a bodybuilding coach, but not even a coach, a leader in something, right? And I think that that's a very big fallacy is when people throw numbers, everybody just like runs to it, and it's like there's no, just not even thinking like there's no way they could know those numbers for everybody. I don't know.
Very true. Thing. Yeah, I mean that type of language is not the language of science.
Yeah.
You know, when we do use numbers, there's always probabilistic statements and variance attached to it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, but so yeah, when someone is making statements and they are using all kinds of always and nevers and definitelys, and they're giving black and white answers, that is inherently a non-scientific mentality. So that should be a red flag to somebody. You know, and I think even for the people who are constantly tricked by this stuff, I think they get a sense like I almost, maybe I'm just an optimist with the human condition, but I've got to think when some of these people ask me this question, they're following someone who I think is actually like a complete fucktard, you know, pardon my French, you know, and I'm like, they've got to know something, because not to toot my own horn, I know they're reading my stuff, and I'm not nearly on the level of this person. So why are they following someone who millions follow, and then me, who's got almost 12K on Instagram? You know, it's like they're following me because they see something. They can tell that I have a objective, or as objective as I can be, analysis of the data, and I try to get around my own biases, and I'm not trying to push something on them, right? Yet they're following someone else who's just like barely a pseudoscientist. And I know that when they read the art, and they wouldn't ask me about it too, they'd just be asking that person, right? Or someone in that circle. They would just take their word for it. So when they ask me, so, you know, what do you think about MI40? I'm like, you already know what I think about MI40. You know, like you're asking me about this because you had an alarm bell go off, but you're still holding on to this idea that there is a silver bullet, and that if you just turn over that next leaf, or you pay for that next product, or if you just find the secret that is being withheld, you're going to get all the gains, you know? And I think until someone abandons that belief, which may even come with a little bit of, honestly, grief, because I think we all get very, very excited about bodybuilding, and the supplement articles are exciting, and the gain 30 inches on your arms in 5 minutes is exciting, all that stuff. It's kind of the culture of bodybuilding. So you have to let part of your emotional love of the culture of bodybuilding die away a little for you to actually be honest enough to not go down those rabbit holes and spin your wheels on some bullshit product or program, you know?
Well, and also I think an important thing, and I'd like to ask both of y'all just as examples, that if you're so married to it too, like the problem is that science changes. And so, like, what are things that you guys 5 years ago were like, this is the best way, and now you know that it was not? Brad's laughing. We'll start with you, Brad. What did you know? What did you know 5 years ago that is absurd now?
Well, and it's not so much that, you know, I was dumb. I guess it was just that I was naive. You know, for me, it was kind of black and white. You know, I was under the impression that, you know, if science said it, it's the way that it's got to be done. You know what I mean? Awesome. And so, for example, it's probably been a little bit more than 5 years. It's probably been more like 10 years. Uh-huh. But I remember when research came out by a very well-respected guy that I really, really like, came out on the anabolic timing window, the post-workout anabolic timing window. And I mean, he just laid it out all in practicality. This study says that, you know, your glycogen, you know, stores are the most thirsty, and they're going to take up glycogen at this time. And so, you know, you want to do this during the first 30 minutes, and you want to do this during the first hour, and then you want to do this, you know, in the first 3 hours. And, you know, it was kind of new stuff in a way. And it was like, that's the way it's got to be, you know. And that was the way that I did business. It was like I had it all planned out, you know, and I was watching the clock, 30 minutes post window, you know, post workout. I had to get my carbohydrate solution, you know, and it could not be anything else. It could not be an apple, you know, it could not be, you know, a banana or anything else that would have a high glycemic. It had to be this, you know, it had to be the glucose solution, you know. And like Eric said, I grasped onto that like a kid holding on to his favorite toy. You know, to me, that was like the answer that was going to get me the gains, you know. And so then, of course, when it comes to find out, you know, well, you know, that's true. There is this window, but it's not quite as finite as we once thought it was. It was like, no, I'm not going to listen. You know,
yeah,
that was my toy, you know, and no, you can't take it away from me, you know. And so there was kind of this, it was kind of like a divergence of a few things, of me having to let go of this love and this excitement that I had. And then also an evolution of understanding, look, science today is not necessarily science of tomorrow, you know. And I think it was best said when Mark Zerto said, you know what, we may have discovered the single worst DUP program out there. There may be 10 more that are going to be 10 times better. Mm-hmm. You know, it's just that right now, this is all we know. And this is what we know is, you know, the most optimal, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. Give me one, Eric.
Yeah, I love that. Just how, you know, in comparison to two studies, the one that wins theoretically could be the second worst ever discovered. You know, that's true. And yeah, that actually brings me up to, I think I said this in one of my recent YouTube videos or something. I said I really don't like the term bro science and the way it's used sometimes, because people will talk about old science and call it bro science. And it gives you the impression that two like IFBB pros are sitting in a room who aren't even like literate and have never read anything, looked at each other and said, dude, I'm pretty sure we have carbs post workout. And then the guy goes, righteous. You know, that's not what happened. It was actually like 15 years of research,
yeah,
and it didn't quite ask the question in the best way. And now once it was asked in a more complete way, now we have, like I said, like Brad said, a more fluid answer, and we know it in less finite terms, you know. So, yeah, I like to get away from the term bro science, unless it truly is just a couple of anecdotal things that a couple of bros brought up. But most of the time, when we're talking about things that are quote-unquote bro science, it is just old science that has been reported, because there's always a lag between the downside of science is that it's very much kind of like an ivory tower. The articles are written in ways that it makes it very difficult for the average person to access the information and understand it. And that's why people like myself, Alan McDonald, Alan Aragon, are popular. And that's why some of the people who are manipulating science to sell products can get away with it, because there is this gap. You know, the scientific community are pretty much the only people who actually understand science, you know. So there is a definite role for people who do research reviews or who do YouTube videos or who do things who try to bridge that gap between scientific jargon and complexity into practical application. And that's an unfortunate gap, but there's kind of no way around it. Even if peer-reviewed research was more accessible and written in such a way that it could be more easily understood, in the end, you'd need to understand the complexities to actually verify the data and say, okay, that's accurate. So it's a tough one.
The thing that a little bit ago, a few minutes ago, and I was like, we'll get to that later, was my opinion that I believe that 99% of way more than that, most people that are trying to be personal trainers, trying to make it in this industry, but don't have like a legit PhD. I'm talking even master's people, I think should just stop reading research studies. I think it's way more valuable to find people who know what they're doing and disseminate that knowledge to us than it is for you to try to go get it yourself, because you're going to confuse yourself or get the wrong thing out of it or misconstrue it or not have the whole thing. Like, I think it does more bad than good that people can publicly, because actually not all of them are public, but that I guess you could buy it. But I don't think that everyone should be allowed to read research, because I think it does more bad. I think it does more bad than good, to be honest.
Yeah.
So we need the research police.
It's like
which some people have anointed themselves the research police, I mean, yes, you are right to a certain extent, and that's, there's the only thing you can really do is be aware of that more than anything.
Yeah. And
that's kind of why I love our team and the way that we do things. We've got this 5-point star, and sometimes Eric is kind of, I guess, thought of as kind of and put on a pedestal as kind of our leader, but he's part of that 5-point star, and he's our Spock. He's our science officer, and the way that we do our continuing education is, in my opinion, perfect for like guys like me and Jeff. Probably more so for me than for Jeff, but. Because with me, I'm a wannabe science guy, whereas Jeff, he really doesn't care about the science. He knows it's important, but if he never reads a word of a scientific study, he'll be okay with it. Mm-hmm. But here's our gold nugget, is we've got that 5th point out here in Eric Helms, where he takes the stuff that either we give him or just stuff that he peruses and says, ooh, you know what? And Eric presents it to us in like the perfect way. He's like, okay, here's the study. Here's what the study showed. Here's how we can apply this to our clients. He doesn't just say, here's the study, here's what it showed, and then leaves it there, and then leaves it to us, either wannabes or for lack of a better term, dummies, to interpret and use on our clients. Mm-hmm. He says, here's science, here's what it showed, here's how we can use it. Or there's sometimes when and God bless him, I know how long it takes to go through some of these studies and really understand it and know it. There's sometimes he'll go through a study and he'll say, we can't use it. It's useless. Yeah. But it was good to know to go through that, say, here's the science, here's what it showed, and we can't use it. Yeah. That to me takes a very powerful person when they can just say all that time and all that effort and say, God, it's for nothing. We can't use it, And
those are still important to do. Like, I don't like to spend too much time myth busting, but I can see the winds of the fitness industry and where they're blowing. And sometimes I know something's going to become a thing, or it already is a thing. And I don't want our team to waste our time, or more likely, because I know the 4 of you guys are pretty savvy, I want you to be able to answer your clients when they go, well, why aren't I doing daily max training, or why am I not doing full body every day, or why is my protein higher than 1.8 grams per kg, or blah 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 blah. Yeah. So I'll go ahead and just fill that rabbit hole, just so that the coach doesn't have to waste time dealing with that. They have an answer. It can refer back to it. And I think that's very valuable. And while I appreciate all the kudos Brad gave me, it's actually a much easier job presenting data and information to the 4 of you than it is to the World Wide Web, who I'm presenting to personal trainers. I'm also presenting to athletes. I'm presenting to other online coaches. And I've been surprised by how often other scientists watch my stuff. Like I'll go to the NSCA meeting and like, hey, I watch your videos. And I'm like, oh God, like you're a PhD. So I know that even though they're probably not gaining totally new information, maybe they are more in how it's applied or practiced or where the interest is. I know that I've got people who are, full-time professors who are watching my videos. So I've really got to be on my game. I can't cut any corners in my analysis. And it means also that I know to stay in my lane. And I think the mistake some people who do the same thing as me do is they will step outside of their lane too often or make too large of conclusions based on things that are outside of their lane. Like I was very comfortable doing my little video on the science of motivation, even though I don't have a PhD in coaching psychology and I'm not a psychologist, because I very much kept it to, and here's how it matters for bodybuilding. This is very, very straightforward. We need to think about the way we, once we start getting external reward, that changes our internal understanding of it. And I left it at that. I didn't pretend I knew more about that topic. And I think that's an easy trap to fall down once you are in a position of being a leader,
Yeah. And I think I want to say too, Brad, how you're like, you say I'm the wannabe scientist. You go, and Jeff couldn't be bothered to read a damn lick of research. I'm the only person besides Eric that has continuing education in this. I don't want to read any research either. Not because I think it's a waste of time, not because I think that I can't gain from it. I just feel like whether it be Eric, Lyle McDonald, them being interviewed, like whatever it is, I want to say yes, because eventually in my particular situation, I could just ask Eric. Like I could. Mm-hmm. And I know that would be more valuable than me reading a fucking paper, because I will get how it applies to me, what I need from it. There's shit that I can baseline understand, but if he tells me, then it's going to be tailored to me and my needs and the questions that I have following up from that. But before I was on with Eric, because I've only had him the last year of my life, it was, if I click Google on this topic, 1,000 bazillion things are going to pop up. Okay, on the first 2 or 3 pages, are there names I recognize? Okay, and then I would do that. Why do I recognize those names? Okay, maybe there's a new name, but he's way up there on the Google list. I'm like, who is this guy? So I search his name. Who is he associated with? Does he have degrees in that thing? So it's like, all of that will end up being far more valuable to me than trying to read a paper, even though I went to grad school for this. I to this day, if you send me a results section, I don't remember a lick of stats. I barely passed it. Those numbers don't mean shit to me. If I had a research paper, I'll read the abstract and the discussion. I know that I don't need to touch that shit unless I'm looking at the sample. Is it actually bodybuilders? Is it animals? Is it humans? Is it rats? Just real basic things. But if I know it's my population, then those are the only parts of the thing that I'll even read. And if I have further questions, then I'll dive further. But I feel like people could, I guess I'm saying anything in life, you need to come up with a system for yourself. And, over time, and that's going to take practice, but that before I had Eric, that was my system, was if I'm looking on the internet. Now, that was probably how it started 5-6 years ago. But maybe 2 years ago, if I needed something, I already knew, all right, these are the 5, whether it's Helms, McDonald, Norton, these are the 5 go-tos. And if they haven't said shit about it, it's probably not important and I don't need it. And that I find so much mental comfort in the fact that I don't need to go scouring, because if it hasn't been brought up by these people that I know are important and valuable, then it's probably not worth it for me. And that keeps me from finding that one line and that one article that is the gold nugget that I'm going to hold and falsely apply.
Yeah. See, and I really admire you a lot for that, because for me, I didn't, before, we kind of had 3DMJ, I didn't have that system. I didn't even know to make that system.
Well, I went to school.
For me, it was just yeah. And that's knowledge is valuable. That's kind of what people get paid for, is for their knowledge and all their time spent. But yeah, and sometimes I was kind of dangerous, because I would be interested in a subject, Google, type it into, ACSM's website or whatever, look at studies, scroll down to the bottom and look at the conclusion, read it, and then say, ooh, that's a good one. And then I'd go through the study, and kind of look through things and see how they understand things and try as best I could to kind of figure out a way to apply it. But yeah, I mean, I was kind of dangerous in a way. And it wasn't that I was doing something malicious.
Yeah.
It was, I was trying to do something that I thought was the right thing based on science, and kind of in an efficient manner come up with a game plan. You know what I mean? And that's, I kind of agree with Eric. I never really thought about that before. Bro science is not something that's malicious. It's just people like I was, trying to say, look, you have to do it by the anabolic timing window,
Yeah. And I think too, what I said, when I just said, like, because I went to school, that's the takeaway that I took. It wasn't that I went to school and now I'm this super smart exercise physiologist. It's like, I went to school and what I got out of it was I need to question everything. And I talked about that a lot in my personal episode, but I think so many people get a bachelor's in something science related and think they know how to read research, and that's super duper not the case.
Can I try an analogy on for size?
Please do.
So, like, imagine the world is a bunch of lumberjacks, right? But they have no idea how to cut down trees. And someone comes along and says, hey, everything you're doing is silly and wrong. This is the chainsaw. It'll make everything faster. And everyone's like, oh my God, I need you. That's great. And then he just walks away and doesn't tell them how to use the chainsaw. That's unfortunately, and you can see that'd be dangerous, right? Trees falling on people, them, using petroleum-powered, or whatever, gas-powered motors, and, moving metal parts fast that are sharp. Lots of kind of bad things happen when you don't inform people how to use something.
Lopping off limbs instead of trees.
Right. You cut off your arm and then you cut down the tree and it crushes Sam. That's kind of what could happen without instruction, right? Poor Sam. Now, that is essentially kind of what the culture has become in our community, unfortunately, is you have a couple people who thoroughly understand science come out and say, hey, this is incredibly important. And now it's cool and everyone knows it's important. And then they try to apply it. And I think, Brad, you're 100% not alone in that you don't have a system to do that because you don't know that you need a system. How could you, know? And Andrea, you're unique in that, not unique, you're intelligent. That was a good decision for you to go to grad school and go right. Memorizing information is really a waste of my time, but I'm going to take home the scientific method and the principles of getting good information. And now I know how to disseminate and structure things so I can onboard things. I don't need to be the expert.
Yeah.
My role is because this is basically what happens out there is people come to me and they're trying to read the full text of the study, right? And they've got like a bachelor's degree in communication or something like that, and they're trying to get into coaching, and they think because we've been told this chainsaw is all you need, they have to read the full study, they have to understand it, or they can't be a good coach. So those of you who are listening, I am definitely talking to you. You've probably had one of two responses if you're someone who asked me a scientific question via Facebook Messenger, email, or the many ways you can get a hold of me. One is if it's clear that you are a grad student, or if you're a future researcher, or you're a future student, or you want to become someone in the field of disseminating scientific research out to the masses. If you want to be a Lyle McDonald, an Alan Aragon, a me, whoever, I will thoroughly engage you and give you all the information and give you a lot of my time. But if you're just an athlete, or if you're a coach, or if you're just curious, but you think you don't know why you want this information, you probably got a relatively blunt, non-very helpful, this doesn't matter, just focus on this response from Eric, and that might have disappointed you a little bit. But trust me, it's for a reason, because if you are just a PT, or if not just, like it's a bad thing, if you're just a professional or an athlete, you need to know what you need to know, and you need to definitely try to understand, like Andrea and Brad have given, a system of getting good information. That's why I'll recommend, Alan Aragon's research review, or Bret Contrera's research review, or
our pyramids.
Something, or that's why I wrote my books, or examine.com. I recommend those tools 10 times more than I will recommend, hey, get a subscription to the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research and read that stats section. That's you're gonna be a good coach, because that is just gonna confuse you. And even if you do force your way through it, it's developing a skill set that you're not going to use. That's fantastic if you want to do your master's or your PhD. Not so great if you want to help Tom, have his photo shoot with a six pack, So it's,
well, yeah, and the things, and that's the thing is it's like, how do we get people to know how much they need to know? Like, how do they have the baseline? And this is going to sound shitty, but only because it's what the reference I have. The muscle and strength pyramids, we spent years Okay, you spent years coming up with the concepts. We spent a year putting it together. And literally, there's almost nothing I need to know outside of that besides how to get better at the art of coaching, and knowing my clients better, or learning how to get more information from them to help me help them, or having data on them over time. But I literally don't need to know anything else right now, right? And maybe every 3 to 5 years, because we're doing updated editions. Again, this sounds like salesy, but it's like that was the point of creating it, right? And then I don't need anything else, because you're like you said, it's a waste of my time. I would be more beneficial if I'm having a problem with a client. It would be 10 times more beneficial for me to spend an hour Skyping with them and really understanding what their life is really like than it would be to spend an hour trying to read the first 2 pages of a 20-page study. Like, that doesn't, it's just one of those, like, which one actually benefits my coaching practice, and the other one just doesn't. Like, it doesn't benefit me to keep reading shit that I either don't understand, or it's one study of a trillion that's new. Like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I'm not trying to say it doesn't matter, but there's that first solution of spending more time with my athlete would be, leaps and bounds more beneficial than it would be to try to read some shit that just came out.
Yeah, and it's always a hard thing because you're walking that fine line. It's like, I could easily just tell a client, well, look, you know what? You want to do it this way because Eric said so, and he knows better, Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of that, but really, it's more so, well, we want to do it this way because we're taking into consideration everything. We are taking into consideration the science, obviously, as some sort of an aspect, but we're taking into consideration what you can do, what your time frame is, what your lifestyle is like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right on down the line. And so it's kind of like, it is a fine line, and you have to just kind of trust and say, look, I'm doing this in the best interest of you, taking all of these things. So in a way, I'm saying, yes, just do what I said because I know better and you don't. But, without getting too much into detail and saying, here's why, and blah, 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 and spouting this research and that research and, et cetera, et cetera. It's a tricky thing.
Yeah, and I want to give an example, too, that just happened to me like 2 weeks ago, was I had an athlete who's progressing through his program, right? And all of a sudden on testing day, something that should have gotten like progressively better because he's a beginner intermediate should have, like, he's been going up and up and up, and now I realize that he's just not. And I could have been like, well, he needs to do more volume, or science says he needs to do more volume, or whatever. Instead of doing that, I talked to him on a call, and I realized that his warm-up is very excessive. So by the time he got to testing, and I wouldn't know that unless I just spent more time with him. I'm not saying that's how it's always going to work, but that's just an example of, like, yeah, I guess I could have read how to bust through volume plateaus, or how to bust through, like, what all the reasons he could suck at a 1RM, or I could just dig further. I'm like, well, how are you getting ready for that? Was it a bad day? Did you sleep that day? Da, da, da. And then, after 10, 15 minutes, I find out his warm-up protocol is more excessive than it probably needs to be. So we scale that back, and he's like, oh, I feel way better. And that's an example of, like, why interrogating your client, for me, is, 9 times out of 10 going to be more valuable than me trying to read all the reasons people fail at a squat. Like, that's just not as useful.
And, not to take some credit for science in that approach, but that is essentially a tenet of science. Is like, if you want to subscribe something to one variable, it means you have to control for all the other variables, and you have to consider what are all the other things I have to manage that could be confounding.
Right.
And that's basically what the whole discussion is like, yeah, we might have found this, but here's 10 reasons of the limitations of why it could be something different. Here's things we couldn't control for. Here's why. So, take it all with a grain of salt. And I think understanding that you can only manage what you can measure, which is also a tenet of science kind of thing. And especially as an online coach, you're only going to get the information you can get from the person. And that's even true of a personal trainer in person. You just get a little more, but you don't get to go home with them, So I think I could keep going back to it, but the principles of, empirical discovery and skepticism are so much more important than the knowledge itself, which is why, honestly, just understanding the concept of the pyramids rather than the stuff inside them is probably a more useful tool. like, sure, it'd be good to know what kind of general practice recommendations for volume, intensity, frequency, etc. But if you simply know that that should be, after adherence, the foundation of how you program, that's incredibly useful. So it's just about putting things in priority. And going back to what Brad said about, how do you talk to a client, or how do I talk to you guys as coaches?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so much of it is, I don't want you guys just to be like, oh, Eric said it, that's the way it is. Like, in all of my content, I go as far as I need to, but not so in depth as to be confusing as to the why and the how of it as well. Mm-hmm. Because you need to have buy-in, you need to have the understanding of logic. And I don't want them just to remember what to do with protein. I want them to understand the critical thinking process, and to reinforce, again, critical thinking and skepticism and the scientific method to get to that answer, so that they can apply it in other areas. And I think people who ask me questions are often annoyed that I don't just tell them the answer, because I take them on the rabbit hole. I ask them, well, why do you think it might not be that way? And they're just like, fucker, just tell me the answer. And I'm like, well, look, dude, if you want to take the time to ask me and worry about this, then you better take the time of actually thinking about it. Or you can just read my book and go, okay, I'll just do what he says. You know what I'm saying? So.
And the whole. Go ahead, Brad.
Well, I was just going to say that's a very good point. Andrea, you used science as a tool with your client. You know what I mean? It was your hammer, but you didn't use that hammer, to pound in the screw. It would have eventually worked. You knew, okay, I need to increase volume here. And if you would have just up and increased volume, you would have eventually got your answer. And so you had the science there as your tool, but you knew through your coaching abilities, okay, that's what I need to do, but I need to look at the whole context of things here. What's going on that I can't see? What's going on leading up to this? What's going on in the week before? And what you basically found out is that his warm-up was in excess of his volume. Mm-hmm. And so you found out through your critical thinking skills and being a coach that I need this tool, but I need this tool at the right time, and now's not the time to use it.
Yeah, and like I said, too, it happens so because we practice, right, over and over. It's so in the back of my mind that I didn't even think that what I was doing was saying, okay, yeah, they're like, for that first example of we have 5 solutions. One of them could have been that, but all the other ones, like I said, sleep, your warm-up, your whatever, your diet, your whatever, all those things are the quicker of the 5, right? So we could, so I already know in my brain, somehow in the back of there, I guess it's through practice, that if we do have all these options, what could make the most immediate difference now? Not that everything comes quick, but you're right, the increase in volume, maybe that was it, and I would have found out 6 months from now when he's overtrained or whatever. But it's just like, that's the whole point of practicing coaching, is I didn't even think about it that way. I just knew if I just ask him these things and just check the boxes real quick, make sure all that's under control, then we could have gone to something more complex. And so just like when you're creating a training program and you're like, okay, multi-joint to single joint, all that kind of stuff, it's like, okay, if I have all these options, what's going to be the biggest change? It takes the longest amount of time. Let's try to use that one last. So I think that's the whole point of having systems, and that's the whole reason you need to practice. Just the same as if you hand any of the 5 of us, if you put a plate of food in front of us, we can estimate the macros like that, whereas someone, that takes time. We don't think about that. We just know it. And so the same as coaching, like, you're never going to know it all before you start coaching. You have to get that under your belt. And, low-risk situations, again, is the best way to do it. So, and I'd like to argue that you can coach everyone in your life. Not in a shitty way, but the small experiment of, if I'm shitty to this person, how do they react? If I'm nice to this person, how do they react? I want something from this coworker. How are the ways that I could address it? And over time, if I've tried 5 ways, what was the most effective? Like, those are all mini science experiments. And that's just how you approach life. And that's practice for coaching, is what I think. And that just came to me as I was talking to you.
I like that perspective.
Just kidding.
It's real good. I mean, the mic drop, like, you earned it. But like, I really do think, like, that chainsaw analogy, like, even more so, I think people just see science as magic,
Yeah.
And if you're someone who writes about science in ways that don't include how to critically think or putting things into the bigger picture or context, you will keep convincing people you're very smart, but science will stay magic for them. So, for example, if I just came out and I wrote an article about, like why growth hormone doesn't matter, or basically if I just debunk something, which is a very, very common thing, understandably, because there's a lot of bad information out there. But if I just come out and I just go, this is stupid, here's why, science, and I can even show the process, but I don't put it into context. I don't tell them what to do with that information. They see that I'm logical and I could tear apart an argument. And I showed something that everyone thought was true was false. And I seem like I just did a magic trick. That's great for me being held up on the pedestal as science guru, man. But it doesn't actually help a coach become a better coach, And that's why I think if I was to give like practical recommendations to anyone who's listening who wants to be, a practitioner with the most up-to-date methods, I would say, get a subscription to a research review, like things like the ones I already mentioned, or check out examine.com, not to plug ourselves, but check out the muscle and strength pyramids, because those are things that bridge that gap rather than just random magic science article. It teaches you a way to think. It puts things in context. It hopefully engenders critical thinking inside of you. And I think that's really what you need as a coach, is to have a good bullshit detector and a good system, like you mentioned, Andrea, and then people who you can rely on that meet those systems and your assessment of whether it's good information or a good person,
Man, yeah, I like this talk, y'all.
Word.
That was all I had to say.
Amen.
Yeah, I think something that's important too is like that system's always evolving. So we'll say like we'll have a system and someone will be like, well, give me the system. I can tell you all mine, but it always changes, And that's me as a bodybuilding coach. That's the system that I need to fill in the holes within myself, right? And everyone has their weaknesses. And what are yours? Like maybe you have fucking great people skills and you need to know the science. That's the only thing holding you back. Like I literally feel, this is going to come off cocky, but because of my critical thinking and my experience coaching or whatever, I feel like if I studied anything for like more than, like maybe even less than a year, 6 months, that I could coach someone else in it without knowing every in and out of it, because I just need to know a little bit more about it than the person I'm dealing with, and I'm just helping that person go through shit. That's all I'm doing. I don't need to make it up. I don't need to make my own theories. I don't people, people are in institutions of academia that already do that for us.
Yeah. I feel the same way to a certain extent. Like it's been probably almost a decade now since I've raced cars, in any competitive, consistent capacity. Yeah. Yet I still feel like if I, basically got back into it, probably less than 3 months, I could start coaching people on how to set up cars and how to, specifically analyze, tread wear and temperature across your tires and what your suspension is doing and, all these things. I literally feel like I could coach that. And not because, yes, I do understand all of those things and all of those, geometric, happenings as you're going through the corner, but because I got those people skills. I know how to put it in their language, and I know how to now critically think. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And know how to help somebody, like you said, put it in their language and know how they respond the best.
Yeah. So listeners, if the question, I guess, that we started this is like, how much does science matter? I think it's just in terms of someone in the fitness industry, I think if you're Gen Pop, it's like any PT test is any certification, you'd be pretty well equipped. And then from then on, it's just learning how to use those tools. If it's bodybuilding, maybe something like the Shredded by Science Academy. And then, or like either the content in that, or I would even say like, okay, maybe you don't have a few $100s. You got like the muscle and strength pyramids. It's hard to plug it. Now that I'm an author, it's way harder to talk about it. But I used to talk about it all the time before it came out. Anyways, is like, if you know what's in that book, that's enough. Now go work on your coaching practice. Like, there's nothing crazy that you need to. Oh, and by the way, the videos are free on our YouTube channel. Go. Yeah, there's a free videos. It's like, okay, understand basic nutrition for your clientele, understand basic training for your clientele, and then go to fucking town on how to deal with people, which we've talked about in multiple episodes. We don't need to drown that out, but
yeah, I also don't want to underplay it. Like, let's remember, like, the Shredded by Science team and me and Mike Zerdos were part of the Shredded by Science team. We put all the information we thought a personal trainer and a physique and powerlifting coach could need to know, and it's still a year-long course. Like, there's still plenty to learn, you know. And even then, you're expected to stay up on top of continuing education, because science is the best practice of your craft,
right.
But it isn't your craft, which I think is the your craft is people, right? So I think that there you go. You hear that, Steve? Okay. So
Steve's our quote finder, y'all.
And it'd be funny if he quoted that. Steve's our quote finder, y'all. Andrea Valdez. But anyway, I think, yeah, it definitely needs to be learned. But I don't think people should be equating understanding science to being a good coach.
Right.
Yes, you can make yourself a very bad coach, or at least a very ineffective coach, if you go the opposite direction of science. If you do some really, really dumb shit. But once you're in the ballpark of reasonable practice, yeah, you're close to optimal already, and then it's just like Andrea said, you're going to get a much greater payout for your energy and time invested in learning how to be a better coach of humans.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then as a subtitle of that, you know, while science needs to be a part of your practice, it's kind of a subtitle underneath that. You got to stay relevant, you know. Kind of learn from my mistake, you know, in 2006 or 2007. You know, when I found that new toy, it was like I held on to that, you know, with just love and passion. And it was like 3 years had gone by, and I totally missed the boat, because I was sure that was the end-all, be-all, and that science did not evolve, and there wasn't a better way, you know. And we had discovered the second worst way of nourishing yourself post-workout, you know what I mean? Find your system of whatever that might be to stay relevant, keep in the loop, you know, and use that as part of your science arsenal.
Yeah, and I think too, something I never thought about as a way of my own continuing education was that, again, I'm always going to put myself to like back before. I was a 3D coach, because I feel we can always just sit here and be like, now we're like, we'll just ask Eric, and like that's what we do, which I don't think is a cop out. Before, so like a year ago, the way that I didn't even think about like, well, continuing education, I never took credits, or I didn't enroll in anything. It was legit, like I had clients, or I had people ask me because I guess I had positioned myself as a leader in the industry or whatever, whether that was locally with the people in your gym that you're personal training or whatever. When people know that you're a figurehead in whatever it is, they'll ask you questions. And when people ask me questions that I don't know the answer to, that tells me it matters to some people, you know? So maybe I should go brush up with that whole system of Google searching or looking at my important people, my resources, whatever. But that was, and I want to say is continuing education for you. When my clients ask me something, I would say 7 times out of 10, I already know what I think. But 3 times out of 10, I'm like, fuck, I haven't looked at that in a long time. I should probably. And that's my continuing education. Like, that's how I know what I need to be studying, is because if I have clients and this is a concern of theirs, it's probably not the only client that has this concern. And so I think that's, again, just a system that I don't even think about, but it's just how things work, and how I've been able to not look like an idiot, I guess, which I think is important. I hold that. That's what.
No, that is important. Yeah. You kind of have to know what other people are interested in, even when it's completely crap. You know, I need to know where the community's head is at, even if it's wrong-headed.
Right.
Or I won't, or they'll ask me about something, I'll be like, the what? Like, well, I don't know what that is. It's stupid. It's wrong. You know, and then that's not going to be very useful to the person. They actually need to be convinced, because the winds are blowing that way. So that's why like I mentioned earlier, sometimes I fill those rabbit holes, but I don't do it with just dismissal. I have to do it with, and here's why that probably doesn't make sense. Blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, and that's just maybe that's a podcast episode soon, is like, what is critical thinking and how do we use it? But because I'm just thinking too, like when we're in the middle of planning for the next edition for the muscle and strength pyramids, And we just talked about this last night with Andy, the other author. It's like, we're just going to go through the FAQ. Like all the questions that people are asking us, all right, what is repeated in here? What is a blaring the community wants to know? And therefore we'll go collect that, disseminate what we think is important or whatever based on it. But that's the thing, is like, you'll never know everything. Once you have your baseline understanding, go ahead and get started so you get the practice with all the humans. And along the way, the humans will let you know what they want to know from you. Therefore, your continuing education spots can be filled.
Organic.
There you go. Organic, ongoing, a process. Love the process.
Okay. The circle of life.
Yes.
Simba Yimba.
All right.
Oh
I think we need to end it.
Okay.
Okay. We'll see y'all next time.